The burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. Why dost thou show me iniquity, and cause me to behold grievance? For spoiling and violence are before me, and there are that raise up strife and contention. Therefore the law is slacked, and judgment doth never go forth. For the wicked doth compass about the righteous. Therefore wrong judgment proceedeth. This is Resisting Balaam, a podcast where we seek to encourage the saints to stand firm with him on his word against all of the accusations made by the world, the flesh, and the devil, as we engage the culture of death that demands the sacrifice of our children. I am Callie, and this is a Wrath and Grace podcast. Go check out the guys at wrathandgrace.com. They got all kinds of good merchandise, t-shirts, music, teaching series. Go check out the app and make sure you stop by their website, wrathandgrace.com. If you really enjoy this content, please like and share it. Help us get the content out to a lot of people. And support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Resisting Balaam. You get early access to this content, members only features, t-shirt, mug, all kinds of good merchandise depending on how much you pledge to support. This helps us produce more content and higher quality content and be able to distribute it far and wide and go to conferences to speak and other things like that. So consider helping us out and supporting us at patreon.com/Resisting Balaam. So today, the topic that I want to cover is it's fairly simple, and it deals with definitions and how people use definitions against us, and how we ought to rightly think about the meanings of some of these terms and the like. So what kicked off the idea for this episode, the other week I gave a lecture at the Pro-Life is Not Enough conference up in McKinney, Texas, on ending abortion with no exceptions and no compromise. And through that part of it, I dealt with rape exceptions and life of the mother exceptions. And sometime within the lecture, I used the phrase fertilized egg. I may have done it a couple of times, and I don't know exactly the context in which I used it. I could pull up the manuscript and find out, but it's kind of irrelevant. I used the phrase fertilized egg. And I got an email about that. And I want to discuss the purpose of the email and the conversation that we had, and give my thoughts about the idea that was posed to me. So I get this email from Rachel Berkey from Free the States. If you guys don't know who she is, go look her out. She's does a lot of the behind the scenes and organization, and works the merchandise and information booths for Free the States. Wonderful abolitionist. I really enjoy engaging with her on a lot of these ideas. She's been on the Liberator podcast when one of the guys is out doing something else. A wonderful abolitionist, thinks through a lot of these issues carefully, and I very much appreciate her and the labor that she does. So go check her out, be friends with her, and engage with her, because she's got a lot of really good information and is really thinking through a lot of this stuff. So the email that she writes me is about that phrase, fertilized egg. And the question basically was, should we use the phrase fertilized egg, or does that phrase dehumanize the human? Does it is it a euphemism that's used, or should we use it because it dehumanizes and devalues the worth of the preborn human? And that's a worthwhile topic to look into. Okay, I need to make a quick correction. Rachel's argument was not that because pro-choice people use fertilized egg as a means to dehumanize the child, that's not a good reason to not use the phrase. That wasn't her argument. I misunderstood. She used it as an example for something else, but her argument had to deal with fertilized seed being a misnomer, and we cleared that up by going through a bunch of dictionary definitions of zygote, as well as medical journals and other resources like that. I just wanted to clarify that is not her argument, and she affirms that that is a bad argument and that we shouldn't use that argument. But nonetheless, people do use it, so I'm going to go on with the episode. And part of her argument was that at going out to college campuses and talking to people on the streets, they often use the term fertilized egg as a way to dehumanize the preborn during the conversation. And because of that, we should not use the term. I do not believe that that argument of itself means that we should not use the phrase. Because they also use the word embryo as a way to dehumanize the preborn. And they also use the word fetus to dehumanize the preborn in a lot of these conversations. And does that mean that we should stop using the terms fetus, embryo, or fertilized egg, because another group of people is using the phrase improperly. And if that is the main argument or only argument, then I don't think that is the case. Now, I have heard other abolitionists say that we should not use this term, fertilized egg, and it always comes down to it's a term that dehumanizes the value of that preborn child. And I'm not completely sold on the idea that is necessarily true. Now, I do admit that pro-choice people and our the people that argue against us very may well use these terms in order to dehumanize the preborn child that we're talking about. But I do not think that it necessitates dehumanizing the child. And part of the reason why I don't think that it does is because, I mean, these are terms that are technically used to describe various stages of development of preborn children. These are prenatal development stages and technical terms used when describing the various stages through which a human goes through in its development from the time of conception until that child is born. So one of the things that I'd like to do today is talk about these various stages and talk about where it gets a little bit confusing, because I don't believe that a lot of times most of us understand the specifics behind these terms, but rather we understand them generically. And a lot of times we use a lot of these terms interchangeably when that's not technically correct. However, I think that within colloquial society, it is an acceptable form of communication to say fetus or to say embryo when talking even about like the single cell zygote, because generically what's intended when somebody says embryo is all of the stages of development and not just the embryonic stage of development. So I'm going to get into that in a little bit here, but before I do, let's take a break, go to our sponsors. I want to thank them for helping support this podcast and the content that we produce. Go check out their websites, The Joyful Patriarchy Wife and The Reformed Man.
We are Titus 2 women, seeking to glorify God through the teaching of younger women, biblically, to love their husbands, children, and be keepers of the home.
Not grudgingly or as a legalistic chore, but rather to joyfully sacrifice in loving their husband and children as unto the Lord.
Giving glory to God and finding joy in caring for our families in only the way wives and mothers can.
As God has blessed us with female traits that make our work in the home essential to a godly home.
It's no secret that true masculinity is being lost. We are attempting to recapture the essence of true godly manhood, biblically balanced just as the Lord intends it to be. We do this by highlighting the interest of the everyday man and pointing them to real wisdom only found in the gospel. One of our top priorities is to shine light on and support ministries on the front lines battling the evil deeds of the flesh and Satan. A portion of all online sales go to ministries such as Resisting Balaam and Bridge Ministries Laredo to further the kingdom and bring glory to his name. So who are we? We are husbands. We are fathers. We are sons. We are friends. And we are brothers. We are reformed man.
Okay, those were our sponsors, and I do want to thank them for helping us produce this content. The topic today that we're going over is, should we use the phrase fertilized egg, or does that phrase mean that we are dehumanizing the preborn child in our conversation? And like I said, I don't believe that it does. And in order to show that, I want to talk about the various stages of development and what each stage does and means. And then we can step back a little bit and find out, should we use this phrase, fertilized egg? So, we start out with describing what pregnancy is and how it begins. So first part of that is the release of the egg from one of the ovaries. And this is called ovulation. And the egg moves from the ovary into and through the fallopian tubes. Now, only one egg usually is released each time. At ovulation, the cervix becomes more fluid and elastic, and it allows the sperm to enter the uterus unobstructed and more rapidly. The sperm travels to the end of the fallopian tube, and at this point is where fertilization generally happens. If fertilization does not happen, the egg moves down the tube and it degenerates and passes through the uterus during the menstrual period. Now, if the sperm does penetrate the egg, this is when fertilization happens. This is why we end up with different counting days on when someone is considered pregnant. They use the time of the release of the ovary, which extends 2 weeks from fertilization. You'll also hear terms marking pregnancy. Instead of from that date, they'll mark it from the post-fertilization date, and which makes things confusing often as you are reading things about pregnancy or the way legislation is written. The two often don't match up, and sometimes this is used to argue for different things like abortifacient drugs and birth control and various things like that, because they're going to say things about the post-fertilization date versus the pregnancy date. But it's at that point, when the sperm penetrates the egg, that fertilization happens. When you have this fertilized egg, it is also called a zygote. It's the technical name for an egg that has been fertilized by the sperm. And this is important because when you have just an egg that is part of the woman, it is not a different instantiation of humanity. An egg is part of the woman and does not contain all of the necessary components that makes a human a human. It's a part of the woman. And in like manner, the sperm is part of the male. It does not contain all of the necessary components to make a new instantiation of humanity. It is part of the man. But when the two come together and the egg is fertilized, that marks a new instantiation, a new individual, a brand new human. So it's from that point that we ought to consider a new human, a new child created in the image of God. And this is at fertilization. So when you have an egg, it's not a human. And when you have the sperm, it is also not a human. But when you have the sperm and egg come together and the egg is fertilized, that is a new human. And this really gets to the heart of why we should or should not use the term fertilized egg. Because it is, by all accounts, theologically, biologically, genetically, a new human being. The technical term for this fertilized egg is zygote. That's what zygote means. Zygote is a fertilized egg. So when we say the term fertilized egg, we are using it as the definition of its technical term, which is zygote, which means that this is a new instantiation of humanity. It is a brand new individual. The definition of fertilized egg itself means that this is a human in the stage of development called zygote. And rather than using the term zygote, what you are doing is using the definition of what a zygote is. And it starts as a single cell, an egg. The sperm penetrates it, and at that point, fertilizes that egg. Now, this zygote continues to divide. It becomes a multi-celled individual human as it moves down the fallopian tube. And it takes about 3 to 5 days for it to enter into the uterus. And then about 6 days after fertilization, this human is in a stage of development called zygote for about 6 days. This fertilized egg moves down the fallopian tube and enters into the uterus. And that stage of development lasts about 6 days. At that point, it implants into the wall of the uterus. When it attaches, it has divided enough to create 2 separate parts. And it attaches to the uterus. It is called a blastocyst. Now, the blastocyst is the next stage of development for this preborn child. It has spent 6 days as a fertilized egg called a zygote. Now it's moved into the next stage of development where it is called a blastocyst. The implantation usually happens and is completed by day 9 or 10. And it starts forming the placenta and the amniotic sac. This stage of development is called a blastocyst. Calling this human a fertilized egg, a zygote, or a blastocyst, we are using these stages to describe where in the development this human is. Now, this blastocyst begins to create the placenta and then also the amniotic sac that surrounds him. He starts to develop, and usually by week 10 or so, most of the organs are formed. This is the embryonic stage. When the human has the amniotic sac, when the blastocyst creates that amniotic sac within the first several days, what is it, like day 10, day 12, at that point you have moved from the germination stage, which consists of the zygote and the beginning parts of blastocyst. Once the amniotic sac has been created, the blastocyst is now considered an embryo, and it's moved into the embryonic stage. So, technically, is a zygote an embryo? And the answer is no, because embryos start once the amniotic sac has been created. Do people use the term embryo? Yes, it's basically understood on a non-scientific level that we're talking about any preborn child from fertilization to birth. Technically, an embryo, when we use the term embryo, we're talking about the second part of the blastocyst stage once the amniotic sac has been formed. So, over the next 12 weeks or so, the organs begin to develop and are formed within the embryo. The placenta is developing and giving nutrients to the child through the umbilical cord and all of this type of stuff. After the 8th week, after fertilization, this is about the time when the embryo is considered a fetus. Usually, this happens at about the 12th week of pregnancy or 10th week post-fertilization. This is what we were talking about when the blastocyst has the amniotic sac and the placenta, and all of the organs are basically formed. They're still developing, but they're there formed. This is the stage that is called the fetus. From about 10 weeks post-fertilization, this is now, you've moved from the embryonic state to the fetal state. So within these stages are sub-stages, and they talk about various things that are happening to the preborn child during that part of development. But should we use any of these terms to describe the child, or is using any of these terms dehumanizing the value of that child? Well, to start out, let's first admit that pro-choicers and people that come against us oftentimes use terms like fetus, embryo, blastocyst, zygote, fertilized egg. They do use these terms in order to dehumanize the child that they are advocating ought to be killed. So let's admit that oftentimes they use these scientific terms that describe the development of this human being as a way to dehumanize or devalue this human being. But does it really devalue that human being? Is it the same thing as what we see with other genocides where they use subhuman language? Usually things like cockroach. That, for whatever reason, that is one of the terms that is near universal when talking about dehumanizing a demographic of people in order to justify their oppression, abuse, and slaughter. But it is using the classifications of the development of humans. Does that really categorize some humans as subhuman? And I don't believe it does. I think it's totally proper to use the term fetus, even though people that try to dehumanize children use the word fetus. And I'm okay when talking just in society, in normal circumstances, I'm okay with using the word fetus even when we're talking about preborn children that are not in that correct stage of development. I think that most people, because we don't really get down to the details of what each of these stages are, they use words like embryo and fetus interchangeably, and I don't think that is incredibly improper to use in normal conversation. Now, I think it's prudent and wise to be more precise with our language, especially if we're talking about things with precision or with specificity. Then I think it would be more important to use the term embryo to talk about the stages of development from the time the blastocyst has developed the sac to the point where all of the parts of the human being, all of the organs are basically developed. I think it would be important to talk about an embryo as an embryo during those stages. But I don't really fault somebody that says the word fetus and they're intending all preborn children from the time of fertilization through birth, and not just all of the preborn children from the time they transfer from the embryonic stage until the time of birth. Does the use of these terms necessitate that we are dehumanizing these children? And I don't believe that it does. And I think that we ought to use these terms as often as possible and as correctly as possible in order to redeem the meanings of these words and to show the people that are trying to dehumanize these children that really what they're doing is expressing the fact that these are humans that have value. So I would not advocate for the stopping of the use of the term fetus. I would not advocate for the stopping of the use of the word embryo, generically, right? There are times when I think using these terms is intentionally dehumanizing the child. And that needs to be called out, like when the pro-choice person says it. Or for another example of when I think that it is being used euphemistically in order to downplay the actions that are being taken on this child. I think this also happens in IVF and embryo adoption, and I'll give you an example. While I was interviewing the IVF doctor about adoption, he liked to use the word embryo, and the way that he was using the word at times was intentionally to downplay the actions that we do to this child. And I would, as he would say embryo, I would say, do you mean a human being, right? To reinforce that, yes, the proper technical term that you're talking about is embryo. It is within the stage of development that we are talking about, but you are using the clinical term embryo to disguise the fact that you're putting this human in a frozen prison camp without due process and trying to justify that action. So in that case, I do think that the use of the word embryo, or the use of the word fetus, or the use of the word zygote or fertilized egg can be used to dehumanize the human. But I do not believe that means that we should stop using those terms. Is it proper to use the word fertilized egg? I think sometimes it is. Because saying fertilized egg, you're making a distinction between a not human, part of a human, an egg that was released by the ovary, and an individual instantiation of humanity, a completely brand new human being, which is neither egg nor sperm, but the combination of the two. And it marks the point of the beginning of when a human is a human, when the egg becomes fertilized. You're making this distinction between an egg that is not human and a brand new human, which is a fertilized egg, also known as a zygote. So I think that as we, what I think we should do is start to look more at these various stages of development, speak about them properly. Sperm penetrates the egg. That egg becomes a fertilized egg, also known as a zygote. That zygote begins to divide as it moves down the fallopian tube. Becomes a blastocyst. Implants on the uterine lining. And as the amniotic sac is created, becomes an embryo. 10 weeks later, as all of the organs are formed, becomes a fetus. And these stages, whether it's germination, embryonic, or fetal, these are all terms that describe very specific parts of the development of a human. And like I said before, I do believe that it is okay to interchange some of these words in normal conversation. You know, when we say this is a fetus and technically it's an embryo, because most people are not talking about human development in these stages in a precise way. So to say embryo, to say fetus, okay, I mean, we all understand what's being intended. But do any of these dehumanize that baby? I think as they try to dehumanize them using these scientific terms, I think this is a great opportunity for us to show that in their argument they are actually humanizing these children. So I think the use of all of these terms, whether it's their definition or the scientific and biological term itself, I think that they are not only appropriate, but things that we ought to be saying. Because in saying them, we are not dehumanizing these children, but rather we are affirming that they are human. We are affirming that they are an individual, distinct human being created in the image of God. Yes, be careful with your language, be precise in your language, but also be appropriate to the context you're speaking in. And don't get worried too much if somebody says embryo when technically it's in a fetal stage, or they say blastocyst. That's the one that most people aren't going to use. But, if somebody uses a term and it's not in the correct stage, let it go. You know what they're talking about, unless they're intentionally using it to dehumanize the human. So that's my take on, should we use the term fertilized egg? I don't think that there's a problem with it. And again, depending on how it's used. Can it be used to dehumanize? Sure. But maybe we ought to use it in order to humanize these children. I hope this has been encouraging to you. I hope it's been helpful. Leave me some comments if you think I'm wrong, if you think there's something that I missed in the argumentation. Then let me know. Let's continue this conversation. And until then, join the resistance and wield the sword of truth. Our Lord has left us here to navigate through this world as priests in the kingdom of God. Apply the mind of Christ and battle against the culture that hates God and loves death.